The most powerful man on earth was afraid of babies. He had an empire behind him, armies, slave drivers, the gods of Egypt carved 50 feet tall in stone. And he looked at a people with no army, no land of their own, no power at all. And he was so threatened that he gave a single command. Kill them. Every Hebrew baby boy. Drown them in the river. Think about that. The mightiest man alive, so terrified of infants that he was willing to drown an entire generation just to feel safe. And it almost worked. But there was one baby he couldn't reach. One basket left to die on the very river that was supposed to be his grave. And that river carried him straight into the palace, where Pharaoh's own daughter lifted him out of the water and raised him as her son. The man who wanted every Hebrew boy dead ended up paying to raise the one who would set them all free. Because while Pharaoh was building his empire on fear, God was already moving. God had heard, and the rescue of an entire nation, millions of people, a story that would echo for thousands of years, started right there, with a baby nobody was supposed to save. Let me take you back. Generations before this, a man named Joseph had risen to power in Egypt and saved the nation from famine. His family, 70 people, settled in the land and were treated well. But that was a long time ago. By the time our story opens, those 70 had become a multitude. The text says they were fruitful, they multiplied, the land was filled with them. God's ancient promise to Abraham that his descendants would outnumber the stars was quietly coming true, right in the heart of a foreign empire. Then everything changed with one sentence. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. A new Pharaoh, no memory, no gratitude, no loyalty. And he looked at these people not as guests, but as a threat.
Fear makes powerful men cruel. Pharaoh decided the Hebrews were growing too strong, so he enslaved them. He put them under brutal taskmasters and worked them in the brick pits and the building projects, trying to break their spirit under the weight of labor. But the more he oppressed them, the more they multiplied. So he escalated. He went from slavery to something darker. He summoned the Hebrew midwives and ordered them to kill every baby boy at birth. And here, two ordinary women step into the story, Shiphrah and Puah. No army, no power, but the text says they feared God more than they feared the king, and they quietly let the boys live. Two midwives defying a man the whole world called a god, and God saw it, and the text says he dealt well with them. So Pharaoh gave his final terrible order to all his people this time. Throw every Hebrew baby boy into the Nile. Drown them. The river itself became a death sentence. And it's right here, into a world where babies are being thrown into the river, that one child is born. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. 3 months she kept him hidden. Every cry a risk, every day a gamble. But you can't hide a growing baby forever, so she made a choice that was either madness or the boldest act of faith you can imagine. She built a basket. She coated it with tar and pitch to keep the water out, and she placed her son in the very river that was meant to kill him. Here's something easy to miss. The Hebrew word for that little basket is teva. It's used in only one other place in the entire Bible, for Noah's Ark. The same word. A tiny vessel carrying the hope of the future safely through deadly waters. That's not an accident. That's God signing his name in the details.
His sister Miriam stood at a distance to watch what would happen, and what happened next is almost unbelievable. Of all the people who could have come to that stretch of river, Pharaoh's own daughter came down to bathe. She saw the basket among the reeds, opened it, and found a crying baby. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." She knew exactly what he was, a Hebrew boy, the very kind of child her own father had ordered killed, and her heart broke for him. Then Miriam stepped forward and offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby, and ran to get her own mother. So the child's real mother was hired and paid to raise her own son inside the safety of Pharaoh's palace. Sit with that irony for a second. Pharaoh tried to use the Nile to wipe out the Hebrews. Instead, the Nile carried their rescuer straight into his own household, and his own daughter funded the operation. The princess named the boy Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." The river that was meant to be his grave became the place of his rescue. But the story doesn't suddenly get easy. Moses grows up. As a man, he tries to defend his people. He kills an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave and has to flee for his life into the desert. For the next 40 years, he tends sheep in the middle of nowhere. The rescuer is now a fugitive shepherd, and nothing is happening. Israel is still enslaved, still crying out, still waiting. And if you were living through those 40 silent years, you would swear God had forgotten. But listen to what the text says was happening the entire time. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew.
4 verbs. God heard, God remembered, God saw, God knew. Heaven was not silent. It was loading. Behind the apparent stillness, God was already moving, already had a rescuer prepared, already counting down to the day of deliverance. That's the truth this whole story is built on, and it's worth saying slowly. God's silence is not the same as God's absence. So one ordinary day, in the middle of nowhere, Moses sees something strange, a bush on fire that isn't burning up. He turns aside to look, and God speaks his name out of the flame. God tells him he has seen the misery of his people, heard their cry, and come down to rescue them, and that he's sending Moses to do it. Moses is terrified. He stalls. He argues. He lists every reason he's the wrong man. And finally, he asks the question we'd all ask. If I show up and they want to know who sent me, what is your name? And God answers with one of the most staggering lines in all of Scripture. I am who I am. Not I was, not I will be someday. I am. The God who simply, eternally is. He doesn't depend on anything. He doesn't change. He was there before Pharaoh, and he'll be there long after Egypt is dust. And this God has just bound himself to a slave people the world had written off and put his own name on their rescue. Now, step back and look at the shape of this story, because you've seen it before. A jealous king, a decree to kill the baby boys, a child who should have died, hidden away, rescued, drawn up out of the water, who grows up to lead his people out of slavery. Centuries later, it happens again. Another paranoid king, Herod, orders the baby boys around Bethlehem killed. And one child escapes, carried down into Egypt and back out again, who grows up to lead his people out of a far deeper slavery than bricks and mud. Moses was a rescuer, but he was only a shadow of the real one. Moses drew Israel out of Egypt. Jesus draws us out of sin and death itself. The whole Exodus is God rehearsing, in history, the rescue he always intended to finish at the cross. So when you see that baby in the basket, you're not just looking at Moses. You're looking at the pattern of how God saves, quietly, against impossible odds, through a deliverer the powers of this world tried to kill and couldn't. Which brings us back to you. Maybe right now the thing pressing on your life feels like Pharaoh, too big, too strong, and it's been going on too long. Maybe you've prayed, and the only thing coming back is silence. And the silence is starting to feel like a verdict. God isn't listening. God doesn't care. God has forgotten you. This story says otherwise. While Israel groaned in the dark, God heard. While the years dragged on with no sign of change, God remembered. God saw. God knew. The rescue was already in motion long before they felt the first hint of it. You are not as forgotten as you feel. The God who is, the great I am, still hears the groaning the world ignores. He still works in the silence, and he still loves to begin the biggest rescues with the smallest, most hidden things. A basket, a baby, a promise that refuses to die. So here's the whole story in one line. The rescue of the world began with a baby the most powerful man on earth couldn't kill, because God had heard. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant. Whatever you're carrying into this week, he hears it. He hasn't forgotten his promise, and the rescue may already be closer than you think. Next, Pharaoh says no, and God answers with 10 plagues aimed straight at the gods of Egypt. That's where the showdown begins. If this showed you something new in a story you thought you knew, subscribe and come with us into the next part.